two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt, the host today, and I'm here with Genevieve Rand. We're going to be talking about some new proposed legislation about right to renew leases. Genevieve Rand and I are both involved in the attempt to get more affordable rents in Ithaca and Tompkins County. I had been pushing for opting in to the Emergency Tenant Protection Act, ETPA, something offered by the state legislation that was adopted in 2019 that came to council and got sidetracked, not defeated, just sidetracked. We did have a program about it a few weeks ago, and that's not what today's program is about. Genevieve Rand is now working on a different measure. It's called Right to Renew. So, Genevieve Rand, tell us about it.
Sure. So right now, when you are trying to renew the lease in an apartment that you're living in, that process is entirely under the power of the landlord. They have the unilateral right to decide whether or not to allow you to continue living in your home for another year or 2 years or however long the lease is. Right to renew would transfer that power from a landlord to a tenant with some asterisks, like people can still get evicted for legal cause under the law, but fundamentally it would take that power over the lease renewal decision from the landlord's hands and put it in our hands as tenants.
Sounds promising. Maybe say a little more. You just sort of referred to the legal, what's legally, I think you have on other occasions said what's legally required to be grounds.
Right.
And probably
yeah,
should.
So I can talk about the eviction stuff. So as a basis for all of this, from our perspective as a tenants union, non-renewal and eviction are the same thing. There are some people who try to characterize them as different things, but from a tenant's perspective, both of them are removing you from your home forcibly and making it so you can't live there anymore.
Yeah.
And enforcing a non-renewal involves seeking an eviction warrant in court. So this is in broad terms, this is all about the valid reasons to evict somebody. Right now, under the law, without the right to renew leases, there are 3 basic reasons that you can evict someone. The first one is non-payment of rent. The second one is what's known under law as objectionable tenancy, and that means that you are damaging the property, you are harassing or assaulting neighbors, things like that. And then the third reason is no reason at all, what's sometimes known in court as a no cause or holdover eviction. And that is an eviction where a landlord has unilaterally decided not to renew the lease. And because of that, as soon as that lease term expires, they can seek an eviction against you on those grounds. What we're trying to do with the right to renew leases is eliminate that third no cause eviction from a possibility under the law and say that if you are going to remove someone from their home, you have to be able to prove under state law that they either didn't pay rent that's due and owed, or that they broke significant terms of the lease or some sort of law around renting when it comes to harming other people around them or damaging the property or something like that. You can't kick someone out of their home for no reason. And of course, there's lots of reasons that we want this to be the case. The simplest boiling down of it, especially, socialist to socialist, is that it's redistributing the power over staying in our homes from landlords to tenants. It's a redistribution of that fundamental power.
Right.
But also, If you are a landlord and you want to evict someone for a reason that you don't want to tell them about, such as discriminating against somebody, or trying to just push everybody out of the neighborhood in order to gentrify it, which also happens along discriminatory lines a lot of the time, a no-cause eviction, a lease non-renewal, is the ideal route through which to pursue that eviction, because you don't have to explain a reason. You don't have to give any reason at all, and it can be because you don't like somebody. It can be because you want to just like kick everybody out and want to start renting the apartment to wealthier clientele. It can be any sort of reason. And eliminating that no-cause eviction would prevent that power from being used discriminatorily against marginalized tenants.
Yeah. So, I mean, examples of, I guess we could get into a few examples of objectionable behavior, which often actually harm other tenants.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of the issue there. Heavy smoking indoors where the smoke goes into a common ventilating system.
Mm.
That's presumably damaging the health of everybody.
That's true. This is a little off in the weeds, but we've come across this issue many times as a tenants union, and our stance has always been that is a ventilation and a building issue that can be solved by the landlord, by the person in a position of power, rather than an issue where two tenants' interests are at odds. People should be able to, do what they want with the air in their apartment, within reason. But I would say that for some folks, smoking in their house is within reason for that. And that if a building is properly ventilated, it shouldn't be sucking air from one person's apartment and putting it into one that's next.
I think actually the situation in which I heard this complained about was not one of individual apartments in a building, but rather one, the SRO type setup where there is, a common kitchen, shared bathrooms, separate bedrooms.
Mm-hmm. But and with that, and with lots of other situations, the situation that we hear the most commonly about from tenants, where when we go to people and talk about this law and we ask, well, what should there be any valid reason to evict somebody? Our position organizationally is that shouldn't be the case, and that there should be alternate, like, community justice-based routes to deciding who lives where. But in talking to people, when it's like, should there be any valid reason to evict someone, the reasons that people come up with the most often are domestic violence and intentionally damaging the property. And there are even us as like a very socialist tenants union totally agree that there are times where somebody needs to leave the home that they're staying in and go somewhere else and be provided with a home somewhere else, but go somewhere else. And this doesn't, this law wouldn't prevent any of the reasons that state law outlines for valid reasons to evict somebody, because as much as we might disagree with some of those, municipalities don't even have the power to do that.
Yeah, and in a lot of those cases, I think probably the person who had to leave would probably not do particularly better in just a different place, but rather needs some sort of supportive housing.
And this is why you're starting to touch on the issue of like I sort of brought up, is eviction ever a valid method of problem solving? And ideologically, our position is no. And you can see that sort of an example of that in the policy that we've written here, where it's, if your rent is increased and you can't afford that increase, your landlord, and we can't stop them from doing this, your landlord still has the power to take you to court and try to sue you for the difference in money. But our thinking is that if you're in a position where you're too poor to afford a rent increase, evicting you isn't going to help your financial situation. It's not going to help you make the landlord's financial situation whole, like contractually. It's not going to better enable you to pay off the debt that you have to them. It's bad for both parties, and is a punishment that's only sought because that's the standard practice of how to deal with housing issues. And so we're trying to, within the power that we have to write legislation, redirect problem solving away from putting people on the street and making them homeless.
Actually, I heard one of the craziest reasons for eviction in a certain circumstance. It was clearly a tenant who had all sorts of problems, who had some sort of a social worker, but for whatever reason, the social worker would not or could not help them until there was an eviction order. And it's like the tenant wanted to get that eviction order so as to be able to go, take it to the social worker and say, see, I need help now. I do not, it sounds to me like there's something wrong with that story, but I can't quite figure out where that.
I know the tenants union would be interested in knowing which agency listed an eviction notice as a prerequisite for helping somebody, because we'd like to talk to them. I'm not aware of anywhere where that's actually legally a requirement.
Yeah, well,
and if that was a discretionary decision, there'd be something to talk about there.
Yeah, I don't know. And it sounds like one of these, it did sound like one of these perplexing kind of borderline cases, where somebody is borderline functional and borderline not. I mean, you also get just questions of different people having different levels of tolerance for this or that, noise late at night bothers some people terribly, doesn't bother others.
But it also isn't a good reason to take away somebody's access to safe shelter and like a place to live. And even with the story you told, where there may be more details to look into with that and what agency was involved and so forth, what you identified with that, maybe sort of indirectly, but it actually plays heavily into the ideological basis for this law, is that in that case, the tenant consented to leaving the apartment. They wanted that notice. They wanted this situation to proceed in the way that it happened. And the major sort of like point that we're approaching this law with is that tenants should have the right to self-determination of where they live and when they live there. So if they are living somewhere and they want to continue living there, they should be able to make that decision for themselves. And if they want to leave, they should be able to make that decision for themselves on the terms that they want to leave on. And so even if that, personal decision to leave involves in a roundabout way getting an eviction judgment issued against them because of the particular social service agency that they're involved in, at the very least, it is something that they're consenting to. The vast majority of evictions are not situations that tenants consent to, and that's why landlords seek eviction in court. So our point is that, displacement or no displacement, a tenant should have the autonomy to decide when they're going to live where.
Sure. I mean, look, down at the root of it, I think the problem in this community is an absolutely ridiculous lack of housing that meets the kinds of pay that people here get. I mean, there's a complete disconnect. And yes, there are all sorts of attempts to build further affordable housing with the term affordable purposely kept vague, because there are so many different levels that are involved and affected. But the problems range from the unemployed to young professionals.
It's true. And often, like, you touch on a very big topic here with what is the solution to the unavailability of affordable housing. For many years in Ithaca and in much of New York and even the country, the solution that has been prescribed to us by people in positions of power has been build more housing. Label some of it affordable, label some of it not affordable. And that solution is very convenient for wealthy property developers who make money from these development projects, and for the politicians whose, campaigns and status they uphold. But a question that is very rarely asked which to me and many other people seems like the fundamental question in talking about the unavailability of affordable housing, is why is the housing that we are already living in becoming unaffordable? And why are we being forced to move out of it? And even if we built all the affordable housing in the world, why are we being forced with no say in the decision to move away from the communities that we've been living in and go live somewhere else at someone else's direction? Because even if that housing is affordable, there's other needs it may not meet that are met, even if they're not, physical needs like disability accessibility. There's community needs too. People grow up in communities and get to know their neighbors and are displaced by the ever rising cost of housing much faster than the rise of wages. And sure, move to in Ithaca, one of the many affordable housing complexes that exist on the outskirts of town. But if you live in for example, one of Ithaca's multiple historically Black communities that have existed for over a century, and you're being pushed completely with no say in the decision into one of these outskirts housing developments that are up on the hills, that's not self-determination. It's not power for tenants. It's not having, autonomy over what happens with your life. And we've seen the results of that over especially the past couple decades in Ithaca, where people have been pushed out of the communities that they've grown up in and scattered across not only the outskirts of Ithaca, but into the surrounding municipalities where access to resources like public transportation, grocery stores, jobs, etc., are much, much, much scarcer.
Right. And
so one of the things that Good Cause addresses, right to renew leases, in some other municipalities, it's been known as Good Cause eviction, which is a little bit of it's a kind of a harder branding question there. But one of the things about the right to renew leases is it focuses very specifically on making sure that people have the autonomy to stay in the homes that they're already in, rather than being moved around at the whims of wealthy politicians and developers whenever they decide that the poor people are going to get moved from one spot to another spot. And if we were to go further with more legislation, I would want to address this question of why is the housing we are already in becoming so unaffordable, and why are we being forced to move around and out of the places that many of us have grown up in?
What I was going to say, when people, and especially people who work in jobs like restaurants or bars where they may not get off work until 1:30 a.m., or house cleaners who may have to be on the job at 6 a.m. or something like that, if they have to move out of the center of the city where the jobs are, they cannot use public transportation, even if there are commuter buses running from those places, let alone from the places that have virtually no bus service at all.
It's true.
And they are forced to get cars and to drive into the city. They can't afford electric cars. They have to drive old gas guzzling clunkers. And those of us who live in the city then have to breathe the fumes, and we have to pay for the parking one way or another, even if it is so-called free on-street parking. It is actually everybody's problem. So, even if you didn't care at all for the autonomy of the people who are being forced out, forcing them out is causing a problem for you.
That's
well,
true.
for the community as a whole.
Well, definitely the community as a whole, because anybody who is living in the community who's then forced out is, still part of the community. For those who have trouble who can afford housing here, or who maybe own their own homes, who have trouble seeing where and how does this issue affect me? I'm not in danger of not having my lease renewed because I've always paid my rent on time and my landlord loves me, or I own a home, or whatever. I would encourage people to look to the value of solidarity and understanding an injury to one member of our community as an injury to all of us, and recognizing that when people who are, poorer or who are marginalized, et cetera, are pushed out of the community, that is a harm to us because it hurts the collective consciousness that we participate in and takes our collective control away from us. And sure, for some people, even with that, they may still feel like, oh, I'm fine. And I can promise you that if that's you, you are only fine for now. As like climate change continues to ravage the world, there will be lots and lots of housing displacement and lots of climate flight away from coastal areas and more towards areas such as Ithaca, New York. And while like there's some aspects of that we can stop, and there's some aspects of that we can't stop, what we can do is preserve the autonomy of people who are currently living in a place to decide at the very least their own terms for leaving, and making sure that we can, take the time to find alternative housing that works for us if we are going to be pushed out, which is part of what this bill is designed to do.
Yeah. So maybe you could give an example of the kind of situation that, let's say, some tenant, fictitious or real tenant faces that right to renew would address.
Sure. So there's a woman who it's August 30th today at the time of this interview. And there's a woman who I and some other people in the tenants union have been working with, who I'll, keep it anonymous and not give personal identifying details. But what I will say is that she has received a notice that she has to vacate her apartment by tomorrow. This woman is a single mother. She's lived in this apartment for the better part of a decade and raised her child there. She has suffered financial hardship because of the pandemic, like many low-income people, and her landlord has simply turned against her as a person. She's actually still able to afford rent. She's actually hasn't had a rent increase since she moved into the apartment, if I remember correctly, and is totally okay with the rent going up if that's what it takes to stay. But her landlord has simply decided that she wants to rent to a wealthier like student clientele, and wants this woman and her child gone. The problem is there is no alternative housing in Ithaca that meets these folks and needs, and the needs of many folks in the town. And I happen to know, again, not trying to give too much identifying information, that this, single mother was looking at living in a single wide trailer on a rented lot outside of Ithaca as her only option, because August 31st has been coming up. She got that non-renewal notice and she has no legal route to staying in her home, even though she's been a perfectly fine tenant, has paid rent on time, et cetera, et cetera. And luckily she has been able to find some alternative housing, alongside reassurances from organized tenant neighbors around her that she can, even if she doesn't move out by August 31st, which I don't think she's going to be able to, that she will be kept in her home by her neighbors. And that has sort of given her room to find new housing. But what I want to focus on is like the impetus for this situation, which is that despite no alternative being identified or offered to this woman, no consideration for how this is going to affect her or her child, a landlord simply used their unilateral power to decide not to renew this woman's lease and to make her eligible for eviction. And of course, as we know, the New York eviction moratorium has been overturned, so the threat is very real. And I think a piece of nuance that's lost often from this conversation when landlords fearmonger about like big bad tenants, which is it's a term that it's sort of like a welfare queen kind of myth where they like draw up these images of just terrible people with infinite money who are just living in the house and not paying anything for just out of spite, is that people don't want to live in an apartment where the landlord hates you. Like, we really don't. That is not an enjoyable situation. And if we have any opportunity to move somewhere else within our means, we do. That is people move all the time because they have terrible relationships with their landlords. It's not like we want to stay in an environment that's hostile to us. But the reason that eviction enters the conversation is because landlords are often not even willing to give people the time to find alternative housing, particularly in a municipality where that barely even exists. And so people get evicted anyway. And that's what happened to this tenant, and it's what's happened to many other tenants.
Yeah, actually, that reminded me of way back when I was a grad student, and well, I wasn't, I mean, I was a tenant living in somebody's apartment in New York City.
Mhm.
And I just remember this landlady who was gossiping and gossiping about other tenants. And I remember coming to when she learns anything personal about me, I'm going to have to find a new place to live, which turned out to be easy because my father moved into the city
Mhm.
and I lived there. But
Yeah, but can
that
you
was
imagine if that had not been
that's
an
not
opportunity for
not.
you?
Do you know what was actually, ironically, what was holding up that whole situation was, in fact, the then long ago New York City rent control. That these older people whose families had grown up and moved away still had their old big apartments and would take in roomers.
Hmm.
So I don't think it was even all that unusual a find. I think there would have been somebody else, again, within walking distance of Columbia University.
Yeah.
Okay, and so again, for this real tenant in the hypothetical situation, that
Mhm.
right to renew existed, but the landlord hates you.
So in that situation, if you're dealing with a landlord where the relationship has soured and you don't want to live in that environment anymore, what this would change is that it would mean that she would not have to deal with threats of eviction while she was finding a new place to live. She would not have to, for example, get a single wide trailer and go live somewhere outside the city, possibly have trouble with transportation access, possibly lose her job as a result, and enter into a cycle of poverty that often, keeps people
Right.
in environments like that. Very few people who end up in that position choose to be in that position. It's often something that's forced on people, and it is a cycle that's difficult to break out of. And so having autonomy over when and how you leave an apartment would mean that you could stay
Right.
until you have found a place that works for you that is outside of that apartment. You would be able to, devote your energy to finding a new place to live rather than fighting just to have a home in the first place
Yeah.
at all.
Thank you very much, Genevieve Rand, for telling us about right to renew leases. This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt.